Live webinar 9/11, an architect's guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, December 3rd, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one of our three-part series, World Trade Center Building 7. It's about the third tower that came down on 9/11, a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. And this was at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th, 2001. So before we get further, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. Just to let everyone know, I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. And also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of this webinar today. Best way to submit them is to go to ae911truth.org, select continuing education, and then pick the live webinars. You'll see a box to type them in right there. I'll also be looking at our Facebook post of this webinar and on YouTube as well for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And just so you guys know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure. Altogether, about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects and engineers to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center. And we start with World Trade Center 7 for some very specific reasons. It was not hit by an airplane, and yet it came down. So we have 2 airplanes bringing 3 skyscrapers down. You know, most people don't even know about the third worst structural failure in modern history, this being building 7. It's just not even known about. I'm a member of the American Institute of Architects with 90,000 members. We didn't receive one bulletin on this historic major collapse of a steel frame skyscraper. The American Society of Civil Engineers has shielded their structural engineers from knowing much about it, and we'll get into that. I mean, here's a 47-story skyscraper, easily the tallest building in most of our states, and it doesn't look that tall next to the tallest buildings in the world at the time they were built, the World Trade Center Twin Towers, but a mammoth building on its own right. It's part of the World Trade Center complex. It is indeed standing here 100 feet, 100 yards, a football field length away from the World Trade Center 1, the North Tower. And it is an extraordinary example here. Even on 9/11, with all that happened at the Twin Towers, which we'll discuss next week, it survived the collapse of those towers just fine. Here it is standing just fine. 7 hours later, though, something else happens. It had a few beams hit it, but this is not a significant factor in the cause of the building's collapse, according to the official narrative. Let's look at what happened at 5:20 in the afternoon that night. That afternoon. The east penthouse drops first, as you see, and then 6 seconds later, the entire building does this. And we're going to be breaking this down. But I wanted to show you what we're talking about. What was the official cause of this tower's collapse? Let's go to NIST's Shyam Sunder. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain all three collapses to the American people. Here's the explanation for this one.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Okay, primarily due to fires. What fires? These fires. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building. As you can see, they are few, they are relatively small, and they are scattered about the building. And you can see that 2:30, 3 o'clock, they're burning in the area on the 12th floor, specifically on the east side, where NIST develops their fire collapse theory. Why? Because the east penthouse comes down first, and it's over column 79 in the northeast part of this building. And so that's where they focus their theory of collapse. So they develop a fire simulation. Let's look at this fire simulation. At about 2 o'clock, we have fires on the south side, the side closest to the north tower. Okay, and they're moving around toward the east at about 4 o'clock. They're showing these fires blazing around column 79 between 4 and 5 o'clock. Now, why is that a problem? One problem is that they even acknowledge, NIST does, that such fires didn't persist in any one location for more than about 20 minutes or 30 minutes. This is acknowledged fact in the fire engineering world. There's just not enough fuel to burn in modern office buildings. The fires move on looking for fresh new fuel sources. But even more or as important as that is the photographs show that these fires had indeed moved on. By about 3:50 in that morning, almost an hour and a half before the building collapses, the fires had moved past the northeast side, moving toward the west. So that's really important. So the photographs actually show that NIST is lying because on the 12th floor, we do not have those blazing fires. So we did our own fire simulation at AE 911 Truth, which shows the fires clear by 4 o'clock, probably by 3:30. The fires are clear in that area. So we already have problems with NIST just in their exaggeration and lying and fraud about the positions and the severity of these fires. Let's go back, though, and listen to a little more from this creature from NIST.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse. And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
Okay, let's get into a little more specifics here, because what NIST is trying to tell us is that these fires were burning on this floor at the time of the collapse. We've seen that wasn't true. They were burned out an hour and a half before. But let's just say that, okay, the fires are burning here. Could they cause these long span beams to expand? Well, no. These long span beams are fireproofed. NIST ignores the fireproofing. That would have kept the beams cool. That's the purpose of fireproofing. That's why we fireproof, so we don't have problems of high temperatures causing deformation to these steel beams. But let's say they could have expanded. NIST is saying then they pushed this girder off of its seat on this column 79. Well, could that have happened? No. Why? Because this girder is tied with 30 shear studs to the concrete slab up above it. These are pins, if you will, that tie the slab together with the girder. So that could not have happened. It couldn't have slid off of its seat. NIST denied that those shear studs were there, even though they had the shop drawings that show that they were. But let's say that the girder could have slid off of its seat. Could we have then had a progressive collapse caused by floor 13 falling on 12, 12 on 10, and so on for 9 floors, as NIST suggests? No. Why? Because there are 2 other major girders tied into this column 79, which would have kept that floor from hitting the floor below. But let's say that they weren't there, and this floor did fall on the floor below. Could it have severed the girders below on that floor? No. Why? Because it would have taken 10 times the dynamic force that was available here in order to do that. But let's say it could have done that anyway, and we have an entire cascading collapse of the interior of this structure, as NIST claims and describes, and then that failure travels all the way up to the penthouse, and you have this incredible failure of columns and beams that then, according to NIST, travel laterally across the building in just 6 seconds when the whole building comes down. This football field size building is failing virtually all at once. That's the claim of NIST. In order to make that claim, they have to also ignore some particular structural elements which the shop drawings also show were installed in the building, i.e. these steel 3/4 inch steel stiffeners, which are welded to the column, to the girder web and flange, both here in elevation, here in plan view. That would have kept this girder from its flange from folding, because NIST says it only had to be pushed halfway off of the seat, 12-inch long seat, and that it would have folded the flange when it got halfway off of its seat. So that's NIST's claim. But it couldn't have folded because it's stiffened by this girder. NIST ignores that. And they then say, as we mentioned, that the 13th floor fell on the 12th. And that couldn't have happened because, again, it would take 10 times the dynamic force, 632,000 pounds, but there's only 60,000 pounds available to break that girder. That's a tenth of what it would have been required to start the progressive collapse, which NIST is claiming caused the subsequent failures. We'll get into what really did cause those subsequent failures. But let's first look at NIST's computer animation here so you can get a sense of the kind of fraud that has been perpetrated onto engineers and the public around the country.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
So the entire east third of this building is failing virtually all at once, showing the disconnection of more than 400 structural steel components every second. That is completely unlike the behavior of a structural steel system. They're extremely robust. They don't just give up their connections all at once like that, as you can imagine. Let's look and see if it does, in fact, look anything like the video itself. On the right, you have NIST's animation. Well, the east penthouse fails first. Okay, but look what's happening. The entire failure on the left. Then it begins to crumple and buckle their model looking nothing at all like the actual video, which, as you've already seen, is a smooth, sudden descent without hesitation, without floors impacting one another, causing hesitation, or as resistance would be due to the buckling of the columns in the building. And they stop the animation just 2 seconds. It's actually like 2 seconds after the overall collapse begins. Why don't they allow us to see the rest of it? Well, it begins to fall over. It doesn't look anything like the video, actually. So we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request, and they wrote back and said, gosh, we're not going to give you the computer input data. Why? It might jeopardize public safety. Well, doesn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? We should be the first ones to receive this and peer review this failure in light of the fact that there are so many other buildings that are somewhat similarly built to the World Trade Center 7. Yes, it has some unique features, but those unique features are really not a part of the failure scenario that NIST is describing. So we use the scientific method with AE 911 Truth. We have a question. How did the tower come down? What caused it to collapse? We do some background research. We make some observations. How have other towers collapsed? We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess as to how the tower collapsed. So maybe it collapsed by fire. There were fires in the buildings. Maybe explosions or controlled demolition. Those are reasonable hypotheses that you'll agree with, that they're at least reasonable after seeing the evidence for explosions. We test these hypotheses with experiments after making predictions. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, what would we do? We go back. We construct a new hypothesis that has a better chance of standing up against the data, the experiments, etc., the analysis, until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated by the evidence. So we're going to start with the scientific method today by doing some background research, i.e., how have other towers been destroyed? This is a great set of research. Fire is certainly one of the causes of destruction in a building, and very destructive in high rises even, but has one come down? We'll look at that later. But fire is an organic process. It's chaotic. There's the law of entropy with increasing disintegration. The building is not going to come down symmetrically all of a sudden. There's an area that's going to be burned out, and as NIST even acknowledged, the fire will move on looking for fresh new fuel sources. And so that eliminates their entire initiation hypothesis, at least their fire simulation, which they used to justify it. And skyscrapers have never collapsed due to fires before 9/11, ever. So this is a unique event that requires the most extraordinary evidence if NIST is going to claim that for the first time in history, this has happened. But say in wood frame building, the structure itself is flammable. The building would begin to fall over in stages. It wouldn't fall straight down through the intact, cold, hard structure below. That just doesn't happen. So how about a real case where they built an 8-story steel frame building just in order to burn it down? This actually happened in 1995, an extraordinary study, a hallmark study. This they used steel beams and columns, some of which were fireproof, and as you see here, some of which are not fireproof.
This was the largest
let's
test
listen.
of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring here to 9/11, when we had not one, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire, and a few broken columns in the case of the Twin Towers. So, and we'll get to those next week and the week after in December. So the steel can begin to warp because it's reached its critical temperature of 1200 degrees. It can begin to warp. And this is even unprotected steel. But even in unprotected portions of this particular building, the connections didn't fail. Like NIST is showing 400 structural steel connections failing every second. Absolutely ludicrous. In fact, this summary of the executive summary says it's inherently stable, the behavior of these structural steel forms, due to the highly redundant nature of them. Well, how about skyscrapers that did have really hot, I mean, much hotter, longer lasting, and larger fires in these buildings?
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage, and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
And neither did these fully engulfed skyscrapers after 9/11. Steel frame, fireproofed skyscrapers do not collapse. Well, there have been some buildings that have collapsed, in this case by earthquakes, natural collapses. The buildings will fall over to the path of least resistance. There's a recognizable building after it collapses. It doesn't fall into itself like a house of cards. The concrete columns and beams in these cases are not severed one from another. Remember this, because we're looking at examples of destructive forces on buildings. These buildings were blown up, where they're thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete expanding rapidly in cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the ignition of the explosives. We have witnesses that hear those explosions. We have witnesses that see those flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Now, explosions can be harnessed quite effectively by controlled demolition companies to bring down skyscrapers very effectively, as you see in this series. They do that by placing shaped cutter charges against the columns and beams at key locations in the building, and then detonating them in a very specific order, usually, as you see here, from the bottom up, but they can do it from the top down also, and it doesn't even have to be symmetrical. It can be asymmetrical if they want to favor one side or another, for instance. So what we have in these controlled demolitions is a set of typical features. Now, there's only a handful of companies that can even do this. This is not something that happens by fire. Let's look at these features. We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but not always. It can start at the top. Feature number 2, there's a straight down symmetrical collapse, if that's what they want to do, and it usually is. And feature number 3, that happens because there's a patterned removal of the column supports all at once, resulting in, or nearly all at once, a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure in the way. This is so they can come down as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky because they removed the structure. This also results then in the total dismemberment of the steel frame. It will fall like a house of cards, the building will, after the steel frame is gone. With limited damage to adjacent structures, that's one of the goals of controlled demolition, one of the features. Feature number 7, there's patterned explosions heard by witnesses. There's flashes of light seen by them. There's broken up concrete floors, if not fully pulverized, because they don't want to have to go back into the building to jackhammer those floors. They do that with explosives. And so there's explosive charges visible at various areas of the building, very noticeable as such. And of course, there's chemical evidence left behind in the debris of explosive devices. If you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire does not cause these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fire can cause less robust structures to collapse when they do so asymmetrically, with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, that can be very helpful. Determining what is a controlled demolition, I have to get approval, right? So there's foreknowledge of destruction. People know in advance that the building's coming down. We'll be looking for that in Building 7, as well as expert corroboration. They agree, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether something, a building destruction, is a demolition or not. And with video documentation, all of this can be proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof that we are now going to apply to Building 7. Let's begin. Is there a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure, which is what is typical in controlled demolitions? Well, let's listen to Dan Rather as we watch this view of the building's collapse.
And what you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? Dan is using his intuition here to try to describe what he's seeing. Well, we've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas where they do use dynamite to bring down the building, or high energy explosives of another kind. But we've never heard him say anything about this after 9/11. In fact, with two exceptions, I believe, in the last 19 years, we have not seen Building 7 on mainstream television. The third worst structural failure in modern history, behind the Twin Towers. This should have been the most studied building in architecture and structural, because no plane hit this building, right? It doesn't have that kind of convenient excuse that we're going to be dispelling in part 2 and 3 of this series. Is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Well, let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. And look at the penthouse. The main penthouse and screen wall up top. Well, the east penthouse on the east side has already fallen in this view, but the rest of them fall a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building. What does that mean? That means, contrary to NIST's theory, that the instability spread from the east penthouse across in 6 seconds to the west side, completely gutting the building, which, by the way, if that happened, you would have seen massive deformation of the exterior structural steel system and breaking up of the granite panels and the windows on a huge scale. We don't see that here. So the east penthouse was an isolated failure, proven by the Alaska study, finite element analysis, 4-year study, which we're going to be getting into. But what's proven here is that a half a second prior to the overall collapse of this building, the main penthouse and screen wall are collapsing, indicating what? The failure of the support directly underneath them. In other words, the entire core of this building has failed all at once. And then a half a second later, something else is bringing down the rest of this building. That is completely contrary and pulls the rug out from underneath the NIST report. And yes, it falls into its own footprint. The center of the pile of this building is in the center of the property. There is some minor damage to buildings around it, of course. That probably was not planned. But overall, it was the most successful controlled demolition in history, is what's proven here. In fact, let's just take the controlled demolition of other buildings on the right, the controlled demolition of Building 7 on the left, and see, is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to at least warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper. Should it not have been the only rational hypothesis, given that fire's never brought down a skyscraper, given that it looks exactly like? But no, NIST relegated it to a series of very frequently asked questions 10 years later on their website. Did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse of World Trade Center 7? Oh, we concluded that blast events inside the building did not occur, and we found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast events. Well, later they acknowledged that they never looked for such. And I'll show you that. The smallest blast capable of failing the building's critical column would have resulted in a sound level of 130 decibels. Well, maybe not. Maybe there's other technologies that are not quite as distinct as high energy explosives. In fact, we'll be looking at those in a few moments. But these randomly occurring, relatively small fires brought this building down symmetrically? Are you kidding me? Who's buying this? Nobody's looking at this evidence who hasn't seen the presentations by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. We put it together in this way so we can make it absolutely indisputable and irrefutable. So, feature number 3, how do you bring a building straight down? Well, you have to remove all the columns on the inside. And a half a second later or so, the columns on the outside. 80 columns, virtually all at once. You do that, and you can get a symmetrical collapse. You blow it, and the building begins to tip over right away. This is split-second timing. Is these fires, capable of that level of precision? Very important question to ask yourself if you're open-minded. Feature number 4, how fast does the building come down? Let's look at the lesson from physics teacher David Chandler.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
What? Zero resistance? What does that even mean? Let's go to this structural engineer.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
And in the case of a column, even after there's a force that's bending the column, an incredible force, that column's giving that equal and opposite reaction, which would slow the building down, especially 80 columns that are 3 to 5 times stronger than they need to be. But even after it bends badly, it's still providing, in most cases, at least 25% of its original strength. That's called the plastic phase. That means the building would have slowed down, but it didn't. And NIST even acknowledges that. They acknowledge having been publicly embarrassed in a public press conference by members of AE 9/11 Truth who said, hey, you're denying that this building came down at free fall. Because NIST said, well, if it came down at free fall, that would mean there'd be no resistance. There'd be no structure. Well, they finally, in their final report, acknowledged the free fall because of this confrontation. The building came down at free fall for a third of its 7-second fall. That means there was no structure there giving any resistance during that time. And NIST just waves this off, pretending that it's not an issue. They do not acknowledge the implications of there being no structure there. Where did it go? In other words, feature number 5, the total dismemberment of the steel frame. We have a moment resisting steel frame structure where the columns and the beams are very rigidly welded to each other so that hurricanes and earthquakes can't make this building fall sideways. That has to be resisted. But it falls into a pile about 6 stories or so high, like a house of cards. All of those connections had given themselves up. And in this case, they're buried by the granite panels and the rest of the debris. So we don't get to see that because, as we will see, beginning 2 weeks after 9/11, the steel was carted away. We'll get to that. But now, remember, buildings that fall due to natural causes, you see and recognize the shape of the building. It doesn't fall like a house of cards like you see here. You can see the columns and beams in natural collapses are not severed one from another. Is there limited damage to adjacent structures? Yes. We talked about that earlier. Is there sounds of explosions heard by witnesses? Well, let's go to Sham Sunder first and see what the perspective of the official narrative is.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
No? Well, let's go to a few of those witnesses. In this case, Daryl, a medical student who was nearby when this building came down.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then the worst part.
A sound of a clap of thunder, a shock wave ripping through the building, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. What does that tell you? And this witness, Kevin McPadden, who's standing nearby.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman standing nearby.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you can just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere. Chaos.
A big flash, and then the building coming down. How about this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who worked in the building itself, or was heading back along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess. They didn't realize the building had been evacuated after the planes hit the towers, but before the towers came down. They're going to the 23rd floor, where the Office of Emergency Management, because they assume that's where they're supposed to report to. And they're experiencing this.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing. when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What sort of sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes.
We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor.
When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs like these first responders were listening to in the late morning on 9/11?
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
NIST tells us that any such sounds were the sound of one floor hitting another as a building was collapsing. There's no building collapsing at this time. The Twin Towers, in this case, had already come down before these gentlemen heard this explosion. And Building 7, of course, doesn't come down till the late afternoon. Well, there's other witnesses of explosions. The official narrative says that these particular seismic waves were produced by the collapse of World Trade Center 7. It's a 0.6 magnitude event. Well, let's look at this in some detail, because the peak seismic signal occurs at 5:20 and 42 seconds in the afternoon. But the building doesn't start collapsing until 10 seconds later. So how can the collapse of the building cause the peak seismic signal 10 seconds earlier? Makes no sense. What does NIST say about this discrepancy? Well, likely due to the onset of collapse of debris inside the building 10 seconds before. Well, wait a minute. That's their theory, that the inside of this building collapses 10 seconds prior to the outside. But as we already saw, the inside only collapses a half a second. And I'm talking not about the east penthouse, which is proved to be an isolated event, but the main penthouse. Oh, I'll play that again for you. I'm hoping this video behaves better than that. Anyway, we did see it earlier. The inside of this building collapses only a half a second. The main penthouse and screen wall there. It's not going to behave well. But you saw the other one. So we go to physics experts, geophysics experts. Andre Rousseau in 2009 and 2012, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and technology. He looks at this very carefully. What does he determine? Well, gosh, the bell-like form points to an impulsive source of energy, not a percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses, low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin, not debris hitting the ground. So that's really important. Okay, well, let's look at some of the other evidence here with regard to Building 7, like the extreme temperatures associated, like pyroclastic-like clouds. Well, the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigation is the authority, actually quite a bit around the world, not just in the US here. They say, look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. And such plumes, of course, were directly observable here as we see racing away from Building 7's collapse in every direction. These incredibly rapidly expanding 35 miles an hour cauliflower-shaped forms. A lot of heat goes into this expansion. In fact, a whole lot more heat than we see available in the building, which these flames are probably surely extinguished by the action of the collapsing building. So where's all this heat coming from? So we're looking at something on the order of this, which we find as we look first at the evidence of molten steel and iron. Yes, temperatures on the surface of Building 7 achieving 1,340 degrees on the surface. These are hotter than most office fires ever get. And yet they're on the surface. But as you can see, there's no fire on the surface of the building after the building pile, after the collapse. So what are we measuring here? We're measuring something deep down in the pile that's surely much, much, much hotter, but that cools off as it gets to the surface to 1,340 degrees. We can go to examples of this, what might have caused these temperatures, as we look at Abulhassan Astani Azal, structural engineer that had a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel.
I saw melting of builders in World Trade Center.
So if he saw the melting of girders at the World Trade Center, well, guess what does not melt girders? Office fires. And he's talking about this piece of steel, which he chronicled, which he documented as one of the pieces of melted girders that he saw, and this piece from Building 7. He said steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated. Excuse me, he doesn't say this, but fire engineer and FEMA report author Jonathan Barnett sees this. This is one of the reports of these three buildings, the FEMA report, the first one. Appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Well, it takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. Remember, office fires are typically about 500, 600 degrees Fahrenheit. NIST claims 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit at the, well, actually 1,500 degrees in Building 7. Well, let's go to the metallurgical examination of the steel, which FEMA included as Appendix C in their Building Performance Assessment Report. And see what they observed here. Never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, solid steel girder formed into Swiss cheese, like you see here in this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. This does not happen due to office fires. Rapid oxidation and sulfidation, they document. Liquid iron, that's molten iron, that's 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel that they didn't know where the sulfur came from. The New York Times says this is perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. Yet, this entire report was omitted from the NIST report when they took over the investigation in 2002 and produced their report in 2004 without any of this damning evidence to the official story. Furthermore, they said we couldn't test the steel. There's no steel to test. No steel was recovered. The lack of World Trade Center 7 steel. No metallography could be carried out because no steel was recovered, and yet it was NIST. John Gross, in particular, the co-project leader of NIST, who provided this very piece of steel to FEMA to be examined in their metallurgical examination and put into Appendix C. And yet when he took over the investigation, he threw it out. His shadow is all over the evidence. So, hydrocarbons, buildings, and even jet fuel, by the way, which there was none in this building, They only produce temperatures of 600 to 1400 degrees. Yet steel had definitely melted during the event, as you see in this material, out of which is pouring molten steel or iron out of the material held in the hands of this crab claw excavator. We can tell by the physics of molten metals what their temperature is. In this case, 2500 degrees for the yellow, and the white is even hotter. Office fires don't produce those temperatures. So what caused the steel to melt? Well, let's look at some possibilities. Thermite is one possibility. What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Wait a minute, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermate were used, it would explain the presence of liquid molten iron. We have an elemental iron. We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. So, and we'll see a lot more evidence of elemental iron coming up, but it would also explain the presence of extreme heat. 4,000 degrees is the byproduct of thermite. That molten iron is that hot. It would also explain the presence of sulfur, which they couldn't even guess at where it came from, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So we go back to the NFPA 921, which says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST says they found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used, but in writing, they finally admit they didn't test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you will not look for. But others looked for it, and they found it. Stephen Jones is one of them, a nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University, a professor. He has sent some samples from the Peace Park in Manitoba, and he does notice that, gosh, the steel itself, it's got a lot of slag on it, and it is not a clean cut. Clean cuts with hot thermal lances or oxyacetylene torches are very clean. They look like this. They do not look like what you saw, and they do not look like this. So he gets real curious. This piece of slag, he looks at it and does X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy. What does he find? He finds iron, manganese, sulfur, aluminum. Aluminum and iron are the main ingredients of thermite. Thermite's made of iron oxide powder and aluminum powder. Why is that here? In its ignited form, that becomes liquid molten iron and aluminum oxide, an ash. So he notices that the U.S. Geological Survey did their own study on all the dust. And what did they find? This dust is mostly concrete powder, as we'll get to. But in 2005, they find billions of these previously molten, meaning 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit minimum, iron, meaning elemental iron, meaning not steel, microspheres, meaning that they were aerosolized and their surface tension formed them into spheres when they were liquid, which is what liquid does. So what is an incredible quantity of liquid molten iron microspheres doing? 6% of some of these dust samples were liquid molten iron, previously molten iron microspheres. What were they doing? 4 tons of this material altogether by extrapolation. 150 times the background amount of iron dust, which you can find in iron filings or whatever, iron pieces of iron in house dust or office dust. That's very different. So what's going on here? The RJ Lee Group, an independent environmental consulting firm, does independent analysis, says these are formed during the event. They're melted during the event. Not before by the iron workers, the welders putting up the buildings, not afterward by the iron workers taking down the buildings, but during the event. In fact, the EPA says that these things are so ubiquitous and so unique to the World Trade Center dust that they're used to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common dust. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these iron microspheres, almost so small they're almost naked to the human eye. Some of them actually are 1/16 of an inch large. You can see them here in this controlled experiment. With a small amount of thermite under controlled conditions, it produces what? Molten iron microspheres, which cool. At first they're molten, but aerosolized liquids form themselves by surface tension into spheres, and they cool and they fall with all of the dust. Could that be what's causing the toasting, if you will, of the top of these cars around the World Trade Center? What other rational explanation in this very high heat event can explain the toasting of the tops of these cars? And you can make shaped cutter charges in your backyard, as John Cole, civil engineer, did in Florida. Take a look. It's actually quite effective. And you can see that it makes a sound, but it's not quite explosive. And he was able to cut almost cleanly through this piece here. Well, there are far more effective devices that are made. And in this case, with Thermite, projecting a stream of molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds, cutting through much thicker sections of structural steel than even high energy explosives like C4 and RDX can, which are traditionally used in controlled demolitions. Why else might they want to avoid those? Well, they have an extremely loud bang and a bright flash that the perpetrators of 9/11 might have wanted to avoid. But then they would have to deal with all of these other unique signatures, which were not through looking at here. And there are devices such as this igniter with whose casings can be made of consumable, consolidated thermite, meaning nothing left but molten iron, pools of molten iron. The evidence gone, basically. But interestingly enough, something else was found in all this World Trade Center dust. in a 3-inch thick blanket across lower Manhattan. From river to river, 3 square miles. What did they find? A small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen collected independently 7 samples. They were sent to them, basically. Like the one in this apartment of Jeanette McKinley's. Her windows were blown in. She lived across the street from the South Tower on Liberty Street. And it was traumatizing to everybody there. But she was an artist, and the way she dealt with it was to incorporate this dust into her artwork. She paid for that decision with her life, having succumbed to brain cancer a few years later, very tragically. But hers is one of these 4 samples. These red-gray chips were found in all the samples, and they're 1/16 of an inch long, the largest of them. Red on one side, gray on the other. They get real curious because they're attracted by a magnet. So they have a high iron content. Well, most paint doesn't do that. So they get real curious. They do X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy on this red layer, and they find what? The ingredients of thermite, iron oxide, aluminum powder. What are the ingredients of thermite doing in the red-gray chips? All of them in the World Trade Center. I mean, all of the ones that they tested. Because there's a lot of them. There's like tons by extrapolation of these particular red-gray chips. So they zoom in to the red layer with a nuclear microscope 50,000 times. And what do they find? They find nanoparticles of iron oxide crystals, rhomboidal shaped crystals, and aluminum platelets that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. This is nanotechnology. They're set in an organic, oops, what have I done? Hold on. They're set in an organic material bed with oxygen, silica, carbon. Well, organic material is what provides the expansive force, expansion, and the force that knocks things over in TNT, for instance. So an incendiary that seems to be engineered to become more explosive. Hold on a second. We've got to get our slideshow reset here, and here we go. So we find in the literature from Los Alamos Lab and others that this particular material, which was developed prior to 9/11, is called super thermite. And just like in that literature, these particular samples from these folks was put in this differential scanning calorimeter, and at about 750 degrees Fahrenheit, they all ignite, producing a lot of energy, which proves that it is a thermitic material. It's an exothermic reaction. It's not paint. And when that happens, it produces what? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres from the World Trade Center dust. So we know where those molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips. As if we didn't know, because they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that could put the real perpetrators of 9/11 away for a long, long time. If we can get it into a court of law, which we are doing. And I'll explain how that's working later. But when you get these nanoparticles, so small, then the surface volume is increased exponentially. So you have virtually instantaneous chemical reactions, which further provides the engineering of an incendiary to become more explosive. Don't try to make this at home. It's a very sophisticated process made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories, not in a cave in Afghanistan. So they've provided proof in this 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal that this is unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology. And you can read the paper yourself. Just Google it, active thermitic materials in the World Trade Center dust. In fact, I'll add that paper title to this slide for you. So what we've seen today with regard to Building 7 is the 10 key characteristics and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition, destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them, office fires. Why? Well, we have one reason. Fire conducts heat away from its source. The steel conducts the heat away from the fire. So the local temperatures rarely get to 1200 degrees when steel can begin to deform, lose half of its strength at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. And to keep that from ever happening, we put fireproofing on these buildings, 2 and 3 hour fireproofing. That's 6 times more fireproofing than is necessary because the fire only lasts in a given area, again, as acknowledged by NIST, 20 or 30 minutes. That's all the fuel there is in that area. But to keep that from ever becoming a problem, of course, we build our tall buildings out of non-flammable materials. We keep tenants from bringing in too much flammable material. They got to have paper and desks, right? But other than that, there's not much. And to keep all of that from becoming a problem, we put fire sprinklers in these buildings. And we extinguish the flames before it ever becomes a problem. So that's the reason we have not lost a skyscraper a steel frame skyscraper due to fire. Fireproofed steel frame skyscrapers. So data. How about the FEMA and NIST reports? We have official investigations beginning in 2002 with FEMA. We looked at some of their results, the Appendix C, but they had $600,000 worth of funding, which was not enough at all. And their efforts were hampered. They couldn't get access to the blueprints. They couldn't get adequate access to the buildings. They couldn't appeal to the public for photographs. Their hands were tied. This is quite a problem, as documented by the New York Times. In 2008, NIST came out with their final report on Building 7. 2004 is what they came out with on the Twin Towers. And they launched their investigation with their stated conclusion that fires caused the collapse. They were simply trying to justify how fires cause these collapses, even while acknowledging truthfully we've had a trouble getting a handle on Building 7 in 2006. But this report, which was put out by FEMA, and the report this is the appendix of the 2002 report. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Right. Well, for those hoping to resolve the issue, unfortunately, we have a real problem here, and easily the largest and most perplexing of structural failures in history. They had 400 truckloads a day starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, shipped to China for recycling. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately, but it didn't. Which is why we have so many experts signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation, because there are people like experts in controlled demolition like Danny Jowenko who say things like this.
Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten, zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Yeah, and a colleague of his, Hugo Bachmann, chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. In my opinion, the Building 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. And 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition, one of which is Kamal Obeid. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Hint, fire doesn't do that. And the University of Alaska civil engineering team led by Professor Leroy Hulsey, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, and his team of PhD researchers, who we have raised a lot of money to do a 4-year finite element analysis of this building's collapse, and which they did. And they cited the problem here. No other tall steel frame building had ever failed due to fire. So it's essential to ensure the public safety that the failure mechanism for the structural failure be included. So first they examine the response due to the fire loads, response to the building. They rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse, and then they identified the types of failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. Now they used the same input data as NIST so that they could compare apples to apples. They simulated structural response to fires. They examined the NIST's initiation hypothesis. They simulated several failure scenarios using models from very sophisticated computer structural engineering models like Abacus and SAP 2000, focusing on the area that NIST focused on with their initiation of collapse, proving several problems that could never have happened, including the pushing off of this girder. It would have been trapped in the side plate by the column 79 right here because it too expanded when it was heated up to those temperatures. They found that they ignored key structural elements like the shear studs on that girder, so it couldn't move. They ignored the stiffeners that we talked about. They proved that the progressive collapse never could have happened because there's 10 times the weight dynamic force that would have been required. They proved that the whole movement was from toward the exterior wall here several inches, not away from the wall as NIST found. So they found all these problems, And then they concluded after showing how NIST basically had committed fraud, that even if columns 79, 80, and 81 could have failed, the building would have tipped over. So we would have seen this if the actual NIST scenario happened. And in fact, NIST's own computer model, as we saw, began to tip. So they concluded that the collapse is a global failure, not a progressive collapse involving the sequential failure of columns throughout the building, completely pulling the rug out from underneath NIST. So the UAF study concludes that the building was taken out not by a progressive collapse, but as you see here, by the failure of all the columns in the building on the interior, followed about a second later by the exterior columns. So fire did not cause the collapse of this building. The temperatures are not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel frame. The thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders. It didn't experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse, again, caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of the columns in the building. So, whoops. So there, let's see. So we compare the NIST model on the right to the UAF model on the left, compared to the video in the center, and we see that, yeah, it's the NIST, it's the University of Alaska model that adequately portrays what's really going on in this video. And now we know how that happened. And by the way, if this was a controlled demolition, there would be foreknowledge, right? Well, let's look at some of that. And this anonymous engineer is asked by Chief Hayden, if we allowed it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse, and how soon? Well, turned out he was right on the money, says Chief Hayden, New York Fire Department. In its current state, you have about 5 hours. Well, wait a minute. No steel frame skyscraper has ever collapsed by fire. Modern office steel frame fireproof skyscraper. So how is this engineer able to say, even at that time when there were limited fires around the building, what time it could fail? That prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge, but we don't get the name of this engineer. No, he remains anonymous. How about these mysterious construction workers who, after hearing an explosion, they look over their shoulder back at the building and then look straight into the CNN camera and say this.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. Building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
Keep your eye on that building. It's about to come down. The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down. How do they know that a building that has a few small fires is about to blow up? And how about going back to Kevin McPadden, who, before he talked about those explosions, which we heard earlier today, he and others are held back about 6 blocks from building 7 with the yellow tape. He's listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker. And he hears this.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Wait a minute. Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? Since when? And what about this announcement 20 minutes before the collapse of the building?
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. They apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. What, does this make them psychic? What's really going on here? What happened with CNN, who announced the collapse of a 50-story building at 11:07?
In New York, Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke, like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sack and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash and building material.
Indeed, it has, completely obscuring Building 7. In fact, had Building 7 come down at that time, we wouldn't even have any video of it collapsing. It would have been completely obscured. Maybe it was supposed to come down at that time, and that those construction workers walking away from Building 7 talking about how it's going to come down were fixing a dud that didn't come down. I think that's what most 9/11 researchers speculate. But while we're speculating, let's speculate on what Larry Silverstein meant when he said this a year after 9/11 on PBS.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
What? They made the decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse? He got thousands of phone calls about this, as you can imagine. He says, oh, no, I meant pull the firemen out of the building. Well, he said pull it. And the firemen weren't in the building fighting the fire. There were clear instructions early on not to fight the fire. It was just very clear. There were no firefighting operations there. So what was he pulling? That's a term in the controlled demolition industry, to pull a building, to bring it down with explosives. Well, through our use of the scientific method, which of the two hypotheses now makes the most sense to you after having looked at the evidence? Now you can have an informed opinion. What does that bring you to? Have we shown the 10 key characteristic and very uncharacteristic too features of controlled demolition? Are these direct evidence of destruction with explosives? Does fire explain any one of these, let alone all of them? Is there additional circumstantial corroborative evidence supporting to you proof of controlled demolition? Well, let's find out. Andy will tell you how you can give us your opinion here if you're watching live with us. Andy, how do they ask questions also?
Absolutely. Okay, so please submit your questions in the input form I talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Just go under continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see it. And we will do our best to answer your question. And in the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree that this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Well, thank you, Andy. And while you guys are doing that, let me show you how you can also subscribe to our email, because we put out something a couple of times a month, some real important evidence, some better efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation, and keeping you informed is important. So it only takes a couple of minutes. So put in your email there and get informed while you're on our website with our evidence section. We have papers and videos galore in there that back up all the material that we've been talking about today. And sign the petition, even if you're not one of our 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation as a technical and building professional. You can support them. We have 20,000 others doing just that. And if you want and can, we encourage you to donate. We're a nonprofit organization, 501c3, and we don't get federal grants, as you can imagine, or corporate grants. They will not help us to expose the truth of these crimes. So we want you to support us, and that's the only way we're able to do what we do. We have 6 employees, and we're working all around the country and around the clock and around the world, getting the word out to engineers, the media, the elected officials. And so you can also join our family of sustaining supporters with the cost of a cup of coffee a month. That's the kind of work, the support that we need in order to do our work. And if you can't do that, Andy, there's some ways to volunteer and help us, isn't there?
Absolutely. If you just got a few hours a week, we certainly could use your help and your time. And everyone's got some kind of skill out there that they can contribute to this fight. So the first step is going to ae911truth.org. There's a volunteer form. You fill that out. It's a very short application. We'll get in touch with you, give you talk to you, and see how best you'll fit in. That really depends on you and how you want to fit in. And if you got only a few hours a week, there's certainly things that you can do. You can contact your local representatives, which we'll be talking about that. It's something you can do on your own, but we can work in cooperation with you on that. You can contact professionals for us. You can look up information, translate articles, help us with our web team if you have that set of skills, and many other things, video production as well. We got a great videographer now, but we can always use more of them. So please, if you've been thinking about it for a little while and not sure if you want to, just make that final plunge, give it a shot, and see how it works out for you. And you don't ever accomplish anything unless you take the first step and try. So please give it a shot.
Right on. And maybe you like to work on your own. That's fine. Send the ae911truth.org link to every architect and engineer you can find, and everybody else that you know. Contact your elected representatives at television, radio, newspaper. Screen the DVDs out there. We've got some incredible ones. I'll show you one of them in particular that I'm favorite too. We have brochures, $10 for 100 of them. Give them out to people, architects, engineers. Blame us. We're the our necks are on the line. You say there's 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. Look at this brochure. Look at the finite element modeling. You can download this for free and print it and give it to the engineers and architects in your community. There's so much you can do. You can print out the request for correction, which we made to NIST, proving their fraud, and in 8 key elements that we've gone over, many of them today with regard to Building 7. And NIST has written back and said, gosh, we think we did a good job. And they didn't even respond to the specifics of these. They couldn't, because it's irrefutable. So they denied our request for correction. And so now we're appealing it to the highest authority over there, and we will sue them if we have to. And I anticipate that we will have to. So we're doing the job, but we need your support to do it. And specifically, if you can help us out with your elected representative by getting the Bobby McIlvaine Act introduced. Andy, can you tell us about this one?
Absolutely. So for years we said we want Congress to launch a new investigation into the destruction of the 3 towers in New York on September 11th. And then we finally said, hey, why don't we do most of the work for them? And that is exactly what this is. This is draft legislation for that investigation. It's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed by an explosion in the North Tower lobby on the morning of September 11th. His father, Bob, of course, has worked with us for a number of years in trying to get justice on this particular issue. And what it would do is it would set up a select committee. It can be passed in either house of Congress to look into the evidence that Richard has been bringing to you in these webinars. But of course, Congress doesn't do anything unless they get a lot of political urging from their constituents. So that's where you get involved. We have action going on continuously to reach out to Congress through our supporters. So if you have a congressman, which if you live in the United States, you do, and learn what their name is, and you can set up an appointment with them just by going to their website and making that request. We've actually written some text that you can just paste in. We're going to make that more readily available to you, or more easy to find pretty soon. And you just paste that in, let us know that you submitted the appointment. We'll help you out in any way that we can to make that appointment happen. And it's over the phone, so you don't have to go travel to their office, because all these congressmen are staying close to home or staying close to their offices now and during the whole pandemic stuff going on. So it gives us more opportunity to reach out to their staff. So please get involved. You can learn more about it at ae911truth.org/justice. Doing outreach to Congress is great. And hey, if you're politically inclined yourself, you agree with the need for a new investigation, why not run yourself too? Because you have all the same tools available and someone's got to do it. So put that thought in your head.
Yeah, and just know that we've also submitted 60 exhibits of this evidence to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, demanding that he give it to a special grand jury, and he wrote back and said he will comply with the law requiring him to do just that. Now, that was Jeffrey Berman. He's been replaced, and we have now submitted, filed an action. What the heck is that called? Do you remember the name of that action we filed, Andy? It's just escaped me.
Mandamus?
Yeah, the mandamus action, which requires him to prove that he's done just that and given this to a special grand jury. So we await the judge's orders on that part of that lawsuit. And also we're awaiting the next step in this lawsuit against the FBI, because they did not give the evidence that we gave them to Congress, which they were required to do under the 2015 9/11 Commission review, which is all the evidence they've gathered since the 9/11 Commission report. So they've got the Thermite report, they've got our DVDs, they've commented on them, they've proven that they have them. So we've got them over the barrel here. That information needs to be public, and it will be when given to Congress by the FBI. The New York fire commissioners in the city, near the city of New York and Franklin Square and Munson, have unanimously demanded a new investigation, a historic move. So we are so pleased to have this level of support as well under our belt now. Christopher Joy, a commissioner, says, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we will be an unstoppable force. So they are on board, and so is 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence in this extraordinary documentary that we put together for you. I want to give you just a couple of minutes of this amazing work, and then tell you how you can watch it.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can watch this free on YouTube, the 1 hour version, or you can get the hour and a half version, which includes the psychologists all lined up telling why this, demonstrating why this information is so difficult for so many of us to deal with in our psychology. The DVD itself has these 40 experts with extended interviews also. A bonus DVD. So check that out on our website in our online store at ae911truth.org, and check out the 50-page beyondmisinformation.org. You can get it free. Download it there at beyondmisinformation.org, or you can buy the really nice fancy coffee table version from our store also. And free on YouTube, again, our classic presentation on this subject, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, and the 15-minute documentary narrated by Ed Asner, free on YouTube as well. And so maybe we have some questions lined up, Andy.
Sure, yes. The question box did not take in any questions today. That's unusual, so we're going to make sure there's no glitches going on there. But I went to YouTube and Facebook, and I got 3 comments here that we could give our own commentary on. First one is from YouTube. It says, most do not want to wake up. Many do. You don't need everyone, just a percentage. And I just want to say I wholeheartedly agree with that. There's so much of the population that will just go along with the winner of any debate and pretend that they were along with them the whole time. So
Yeah.
you do not need everybody involved. There's so many people that'll say they agree or disagree, but what can they themselves do about it? It's the people that decide they themselves can do something about it that are the real players and the real people that you want to focus on.
Yeah, good point. The ones who are active, the ones who care enough to be out front, like AE 9/11 Truth, buoyed up by you, our supporters. People don't just go crying out in the street generally for no reason. They have something that they're impassioned about, and quite often it's the truth. Quite often the conspiracy is a real one. And in fact, you can almost guarantee when the mainstream media says, oh, a conspiracy theory, there they go again, it's probably true by percentages. Would you agree, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, a pretty good rule of thumb, I'm not saying it's accurate 100% of the time, but probably 90% is that if the corporate media is telling you something, the opposite is likely true. If they're telling you not to believe something, then you should look into it at the very least. If they're telling you to believe something, you should question it. So if you follow that little compass, then I think you'll be pretty well off in life, at least in terms of knowledge.
Yeah.
The next one is, and this is from Facebook, you would think they would have to rewrite all their textbooks and building codes, fire codes, so this would never happen again. Did they? LOL.
Well, it is an LOL because here we have a 47-story skyscraper collapse due to fire alone. Now, fire has never brought down a skyscraper, a steel frame skyscraper, fireproofed, ever. And I mean, ever. There's 100 years of skyscraper design to draw from, and not one of them has collapsed by fire. Shouldn't that tell us something? And here's one that collapses due to these small fires that are randomly occurring around the building. And all of a sudden, this building collapses in 6.5 seconds, symmetrically, due to those fires. I mean, come on. You've got to be kidding me. And so we have to look and see, gosh, what happened here? Shouldn't all of the structural codes have been changed throughout the world to make sure that that never happens again? And guess how many structural codes changed as a result? Not one. The Conference of Building Officials has not seen fit to change one of the structural codes that NIST recommended. They did change some exiting requirements. They did change some fireproofing adhesion requirements. But they know these buildings are safe. So it's a complete contradiction in the construction industry here. It's like everybody just shuts their eyes and just moves on.
Right. I don't think the construction industry, engineers, or architects are any different from the general population. Before you can dive into their expertise, you have to get past the cognitive dissonance that goes up over the eyes of many people in any country in the world, not just the United States, of course. All right, the final comment here says, I try to believe the official story of 9/11. I try to see both sides, and it just does not add up over and over. Damn you, rational thinking. They don't like that either. And,
no. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that when I first woke up to this, I was not one of those people that questioned these types of things at first. And I really did try to look at both sides of this to the point where I would pose as either, because I wasn't a truther yet, I wasn't a debunker or anything like that. I would pose as a truther and as a debunker and ask questions of people as a debunker to another debunker and ask them questions that Richard was raising on the internet, and a lot of times they could not answer it, or they would just sort of dismiss it without any, without actually attacking the question or looking into any of the facts. And that's how I came to the realization that Richard was right, and so many of the other people in the 9/11 Truth movement, and we need this new investigation. So I think everyone should approach things in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Damn you, rational thinking. Yeah, it's hard to get people to open up to this. I mean, it threatens our worldview, really. I mean, those of us who want to believe our government, who want to believe our TV, the mainstream media. I mean, after all, this is where most people get their information. And if they're lying to us hand, foot, and mouth, wrong analogy, they're lying through their teeth. This involves a conspiracy that is so well coordinated from the tops of government to the tops of industry, including the airlines, including the insurance industry, the media. Well, who owns the media? I mean, have you ever thought about this? The Project Centered from Sonoma State University did, and they found through extensive research that 95% of the mainstream media is owned by just 5 corporations. And those are corporations, the boards of directors of which sit on all of them in the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry. That's who controls those 5 corporations. It's bad. I mean, it's worse than you could have imagined. And probably worse than that too. So 9/11 is the domino that begins to tip over the awareness, if you will, of these other conspiracies like this out there. And that's what it woke me up bad. I mean, it was like a 2x4, several of them over the years. Just like, no, not this one too. No, not JFK too, not this one and that one. We don't name them all here because we don't want to be castigated as conspiracy theorists. We want to maintain our technical credibility as building professionals. But yeah, did you begin to wake up to a lot of other stuff too, Andy?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I was not the type of person that questioned things like this. I didn't laugh at people who said these kinds of things. I just didn't really care. But 9/11 was something that killed thousands of people. And then when I first saw the questions, I thought it was a joke someone was making, and it turned out they weren't joking. And then I couldn't debunk it, like I said. And then, of course, it makes you start looking at everything else. One of the knee-jerk reactions that people have is that, why wouldn't somebody talk, or why wouldn't somebody be a whistleblower at some of these organizations that are helping keep this issue stifled. But as you get out into the world more and you work in certain businesses that I have, you kind of understand that people are there for the specific reason that they're not going to be the type that rock the boat. That's why they pay them more money as they get further and further to the top. It's not the low-level people that are in the position to see things and like in terms of the NIST report and the cover up there, and just the shoddy report that they did, they're not in the position so much to see things, to be able to blow the whistle, as people who are going to be at the higher ups. And of course, they're going to be there because they're not going to be the personality types that are going to step forward if they're making their money and they're worried about their pension and putting kids through college, these kind of real life concerns. They're more likely to go with the flow. So experiencing life more in the adult world, you learn more how these things can be kept under lock and key. People don't think about the big picture so much as their own personal small picture. That's been my observation.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, that brings us to next week. We will be looking at part 2, the Twin Towers. If we haven't taken down enough of your worldview now, come back and join us in a week, because we'll be looking at the Twin Towers explosive destruction in part 2 with an overview of this evidence, explosions seen by hundreds of witnesses before the buildings came down, the sudden near free fall collapse of this building also, and the high velocity lateral ejections hurling structural steel 4-ton pieces 600, 800 feet at 80 miles an hour laterally, individually, freely flying, the midair pulverization of the concrete floors into powder, and the shattering of the steel frame into individual components, all of which is outside the footprint, so none of which could have contributed to the actual crushing of this building. I mean, it is so obvious once you get into it. And then the week after that, we get into part 3, the Twin Towers in extreme heat, where we explore in much greater detail than we did today the extreme heat available at the Twin Towers. So with that, I want to thank Andy and all of you viewers. Remember to like and subscribe our YouTube and all the appropriate stuff on Facebook that makes us get out there more. So we have to expand our reach. So please share this material with everybody that you know. Very, very important. Wake them up too. Don't just stand by and wait for them to yell at you because you didn't tell them about this. Okay, take a stand. Okay, we are. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch up with